I'm your host, David. This is the Cold War Channel, and I am joined today by a special guest, Dr. Robert Hornsby from the University of Leeds. Dr. Robert Hornsby is an associate professor of modern European history at the University of Leeds. Good afternoon, Dr. Hornsby.
Good afternoon, David.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Just to let everybody know, Dr. Hornsby, you have recently written and released, congratulations, a new book, The Soviet Sixties. And you've agreed graciously to come on and talk to us about the book. Tell us a little bit about it, and hopefully encourage people to go out and pick up a copy and read it for themselves, because it is an excellent, excellent piece of work, having read it myself. To begin with, please tell us a little bit about your background and how you actually came to write this book.
Okay. Firstly, thank you, David, for having me on. So my background, I suppose I started moving in towards academia, specialising in the Soviet Union. In the 2000s, I did an MA in Russian and East European Studies, then went on to a PhD. That became the basis for my first book in 2013, which was called, I should remember, Protest, Reform and Repression in Khrushchev's Soviet Union. Since that time, I've mostly been working on material around Soviet youth and youth culture and the Komsomol, that's the Communist Youth League. But then a handful of years ago, I paused the kind of fundamental research that I was able to do at the time in Moscow and in Kiev and Minsk as well. And I shifted to writing this book, The Soviet Sixties, which is a kind of, it's a synthesis. So this is essentially kind of bringing together all of the sort of new developments in the field, I suppose. So the real reason for doing this, there are multiple reasons, but I guess one of the first sort of catalysts that got me moving was when I came to the University of Leeds. I was setting up a new module around my kind of main research area. This is the period in question. And in looking for a kind of a core text that I could, get students to read before we began, there was nothing that came close to covering the kinds of things I wanted. There are stacks of really fantastic books about this period, but they're all kind of focused and quite compartmentalized on their own areas. And probably the best thing that was available at the time, at least, was William Taubman's incredible biography of Khrushchev, which is an incredible piece of scholarship. I would urge anyone interested in the period to take a look. But still, it's a biography of one man, and that's not really what I wanted to be doing with this module. So ultimately, I kind of came to a position of saying, well, if what you want doesn't exist, then create it. And that's ultimately where we are, that I wanted a kind of an entry point for study of this period, a kind of an overview that looks at lots of different sort of themes and events of the period. And so that was one of the key points. I think another point, which kind of came to me almost instantly after thinking there should be a book about this, was ultimately that there really should be a book about this, because there are so many interesting things going on, whether it be singular events or themes across the period. So I would suggest, I'd struggle to think of a more kind of action-packed era in the history of any country almost. And I don't just say that as a hard sell. There's kind of, we have things, within days of Stalin's death, they start to empty the Gulag. We have the nuclear arms race. We have de-Stalinization. We have one failed coup attempt, one successful coup attempt. We've got the Cuban Missile Crisis, which people will have heard of, obviously. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff in that sort of sphere as well. Soviet attempts to interact with countries gaining independence in Africa and Asia and so on and so forth. We have the arrival in the Soviet Union of rock and roll, for example, the Beatles and all this kind of stuff. There are incredible works of literature being published, social changes, all sorts of stuff going on. And I wanted to try and kind of capture and package all of that in a way where these different subjects kind of interact and talk to each other rather than just sort of sit separately on their own. I suppose the other thing that I was thinking about in this respect is trying to make sure that we kind of, I suppose, broaden out what is in the mainstream of Soviet history. So as I've already mentioned, people will for sure know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, at least in outline. And I wanted that to kind of sit alongside a whole host of other events and themes for the period. And also the kind of thing that historians have thankfully become more interested in recent years, kind of giving more, I suppose, prominence, more voice to kind of groups and themes which have not necessarily always had much of a place in, especially the mainstream literature. There's always been kind of specialist literature on, women in the Soviet Union, for example, but that hasn't always translated into the sort of the main themes of, the big works that people buy in bookstores rather than take out of university libraries. So I was interested in kind of making sure that the picture of the Soviet Union, for example, is more Soviet, that it's not just about Russia, which is, is the heartland of the Soviet regime for sure. But Russians only make up around half of the Soviet population. So I wanted more focus on, for example, Ukrainians, people in the Baltic states, in Central Asia especially. There is good literature, but it's far, far smaller than you will find on other areas. And also themes. There are so many kind of themes in new works around subjects like fashion, for example, and living standards and sexuality, which I wanted to see kind of migrate into mainstream understanding of the Soviet Union rather than just, kind of restricted to the sort of academic community who really focus on this professionally. So that there are multiple different reasons for taking this book on in that sense.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I have to say, I really did, when I was reading through the book, I really enjoyed the way that you tie all of these quite disparate threads together, because it's not just social history, it's not just politics, but I think you do an excellent job of showing how they all interconnect and they weave together to sort of form it's a sort of a cliche, but a much broader tapestry in terms of showing what the book covers is a 15-year period from the death of Stalin up until 1968 and Prague Spring, and it's this period of, as you just described, like quite radical-ish change through the Soviet sphere. Now, the book does cover an extremely wide period of time. I mean, 15 years doesn't feel like it might not feel like a long time, but in terms of the amount of events and changes that you're talking about in the book, it is an extremely wide time period. It's also an incredibly wide geography, very, very disparate in a lot of ways, and a lot of broad subject matters. How did you choose sources to work with? Were there specific archives? Was it more taking like secondary sources and weaving a thread together to paint a broader picture? How did you sort of make those decisions in terms of how to put the book together and what material to use?
Mm-hmm. I'm not all that methodical as a person, so there was a certain scattergun element to at first at least. So I really enjoyed actually just reading everything that I could. So I've been working on this theme for years. I've not come to this completely out of the blue. But yeah, once I decided to write kind of a mainstream history of the period, the first thing I did was essentially just read about everything, whether it be about Soviet dance or about cosmonauts or nuclear arms race or Islam in the Soviet Union, everything that I could put my hands on. And eventually, as the notes start to pile up, I'm a pen and paper sort of old-fashioned in that respect. As they start to pile up, I start to kind of work out areas that I really feel I ought to cover better. To start taking account of, well, I've got plenty of interesting material around this. I know what I want to say here, but other subjects. So, for example, if I'm thinking about Central Asia, for example, something which has, to my shame, not necessarily penetrated my sort of research to a particularly great degree prior to this. So it's kind of working out where your weaknesses are in coverage and sort of trying to do that, trying to make sure you've covered those sorts of bases. Because there, as I said, there is an absolute ton of interesting research, but it's sort of dotted about all over the place. In terms of challenges and source material, I mean, this goes without saying, but the pandemic did not help. So I was about a year into this project once the pandemic arrived. I had visions of, as I'd been doing for years, go to Russia, do some work in the archives and libraries in Moscow and so on and elsewhere. Obviously that instantly became a non-starter during COVID and has never been picked up since, and possibly never will be again, I don't know, after the invasion of Ukraine. There is, though, an absolute stack of interesting material online in all kinds of forms. So if you're interested in Soviet history and you don't necessarily have a great university library that you can go and really dig around in, fortunately I do, and once COVID eased off, then I was back in there grabbing armfuls of books and so on. But there's also loads of really useful material on places like the Wilson Center Online Archive, for example. So you can always find something useful if you're trying. So yeah, naturally I also found lots of interesting material days after having submitted the final manuscript, lots of stuff that I felt would be useful, and if only I could get this back into the book somehow, but not to be. So I guess the key challenge for me in this respect was what to leave out, how to find a balance between covering the stuff that you have to cover. I mean, you can't write a history of this period without talking about, at some length, talking about the secret speech, for example, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are things that it would be too weird if they weren't in there. But equally, I'm conscious that I did not want these to kind of dominate the storyline either, and that I wanted, as I said, to get in these more unheralded topics and themes as well, so that there were questions about, this doesn't sound quite right, but how little can I say about some of these big issues that people know? There are, if all you're interested in is the Cuban Missile Crisis, there are better books than mine. If you can read Sergei Plokhy or something, a really good in-depth book about this, and I'm covering it, but in a different way, as part of a much bigger picture. So, there's a balance element to struggle with this. Ultimately, I think, had it been entirely up to me, the word count, it's about 140,000 words. It's a decent sized book. Probably, if I'd been given full responsibility, it might have been a lot longer, but I suspect it might have been worse for that. I'm not sure. I think Yale would have liked it to be a bit shorter than it is. So yeah, there's a certain compromise element in that sense. But yeah, the kind of question mark was always, well, what has to give if I'm going to keep this at a reasonable length that somebody might one day expect to read? And what gave usually was the kind of political, that sort of content of sort of squabbles and fights within the Politburo Presidium, I should say. Different members of the leadership sort of haranguing each other over various subjects, some of which is really interesting and gossipy and sort of the sort of stuff you want in a mainstream history, knowing what Molotov really thought of Khrushchev and so on, and all the horrible things he said about him. But ultimately, yeah, that stuff kind of got pushed to one side in order to make sure I could sort of get more coverage of, issues like Islam and Judaism in the Soviet Union, or whether this be kind of more coverage of issues specifically relating to the sort of female experience of the period. So, for example, around the re-legalization of abortion in the 1950s. So yeah, I suppose the biggest challenge, it wasn't finding material per se, it was working out what's good. Although actually, as I say that, it's also true that there's still a huge amount of material and a huge amount of themes which a historian can completely rewrite at some point. So there is useful KGB material available online, mostly in Russian still. But there's 90+% of it that's still locked away. If that stuff, if that stuff ever becomes open, we might find that we're totally redrawing what I've had to say about the KGB, and I'm fine with that. And one day, presumably, we'll have much richer secondary literature on, as I've mentioned, Central Asia, on, for example, rural life in the Soviet Union. There's some. I'd like there to be more. So hopefully, in time, there will be more sort of wealth to draw on, if indeed anyone ever chooses to update.
Well, I can certainly say that one of the things that I have learned from the book is that when being approached to do an author interview and being offered the book, when deciding on timelines, make sure to ask how long the book is in advance of making dates. So that's.
Did I take you by surprise?
Somewhat. It's as Dr. Hornsby said, it is a rather substantial book, but it is absolutely the cover art is phenomenal. Certainly, huge kudos to the individual who put that together. It's got a very.
I can take no credit whatsoever for the cover.
It has a very evocative feel of sort of this 60s capture. It's a very elegant book.
Thank you.
Now, there's a nice tie-in actually to my next question. The title itself, the Soviet 60s, it's very evocative of this sort of the social liberalization that's taking place in the West. How does the Soviet 60s as a time period how does that compare to the 60s in the West? Are there strong parallels? Are they interlinked? Are they quite disparate? Like, how does that? The title is a deliberate choice, obviously.
Oh yes, yeah. So there are really striking parallels with the kind of 60s era as we think of it in the West, but there are also really important differences as well. And I should say, of course, that when I talk about the 60s, I am talking about an era rather than January 1960 to December 69. And periodizations vary by country to country, but typically, for example, the American 60s era starts somewhere in the 50s and ends somewhere in the 70s, generally speaking. And so this one I've kind of started with 53. I think the death of Stalin is enough. It's not a complete sort of caesura in Soviet history, but it's a big enough deal. And there's a whole host of reforms which characterize the period, which could only happen once Stalin is gone. So, for example, this is releasing people from the Gulag and so on, growing interactions with the outside world, whether that be the West or else the developing world. So yeah, 1953 seems to be a sort of a crucial point at which a different era begins in that respect. So the name the Soviet 60s, you're right, this absolutely alludes to a Soviet Union which has a 60s era which is connected, if not the same, to a lot of what goes on in the West. And we see all kinds of parallels, which, if not exactly the same, they at least help us to understand the specifics of the period. So things like, and this isn't just the West, I should say, there's a growing body of literature now on the global 60s. So this is taking in, Latin America, and Asia, Africa. So this isn't just a sort of a Euro-American thing. But certainly things like rising education levels, rising living standards, changing consumer habits, what people buy and want and wear and these sorts of things. They're changing globally in the 60s, especially in sort of bigger towns and cities, maybe less so in villages and so on. We also have this kind of, which we see in the West for sure, this sort of foregrounding of youth and sort of changing youth culture and tastes and so on. We also have kind of growing international interactions and entanglements. You don't really get the 60s era, as it were, whether you're thinking about, protests over Vietnam in the US or the events in France in 68 and so on. These are all really very much tied in with international affairs rather than just domestic matters. And the Soviet Union definitely part of that picture. There is, for example, the regime is kind of interacting more and more with Latin America, countries in Africa struggling for independence from European colonial powers. They're also publishing kind of big Western authors, people like Hemingway, for example. They're showing Western movies. They're also publishing authors from Africa and China and so on, and movies as well. Bollywood movies become very big in the Soviet Union from the sort of 60s onwards, for example. So there are lots of kind of important trends in this way. I suppose another one that's worth talking about is modernity, a sort of embrace of the modern, in the sense of, I know in this country, in the UK, for example, there's a sort of a notoriety around 60s architecture being this sort of, the sort of brutalism. I actually quite like it, to be honest with you. But the Soviet Union has much the same sort of thing of sort of the Stalin era, sort of neoclassical architecture and grandiose buildings. And in the Khrushchev era, it's all kind of glass and steel, and everything is sort of much more consciously modern. So there's something in that as well about sort of an embrace of modernity. And I suppose we might also think of, well, all kinds of things. So we don't really have a sexual revolution in the Soviet Union. I don't know whether scholarship says that we do or don't in the West. I know that's a kind of an idea that we have. So while we don't have a kind of full-on sexual revolution, we do see important changes in all kinds of ways around changing attitudes towards sex before marriage, for example, around things like contraception. This is not, as I said, this is not the same kind of revolution as in the West, but we do see important trends which are absolutely sort of characteristic for the period in question. As I said already, lots of the big sort of Western idols of the age are huge in the Soviet Union too. So the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, it's first jazz music, and then, as you progress into the 60s, you've got all these sort of Western rock and roll groups appearing, writers, people like Hemingway, Salinger. People fall in love with Catcher in the Rye when it's translated into Russian, for example. And you get lots and lots of young people, a growing number. It starts in the 50s, but grows considerably into the 60s, kind of appropriating Western dress, whether this be kind of really quite badly appropriating. In the case of the sort of 50s, essentially anything garish is kind of understood to be Western, and dancing the Charleston and things like this. And then by the 60s, you're getting, sort of men wearing longer hair, and jeans are the sort of the fashion that everybody is trying to wear, and so on. So yeah, you get lots of the same sorts of cultural trends. I suppose the last similarity I'd point to in this respect is that we also see a kind of a growing conservative sort of resentment. This notion that we definitely see in the US of sort of the country's going to hell in a handcart. What's going on? Young people are sort of, they're cutting loose. Proper authority is being challenged. And this kind of feeds into the next part, which is that sort of then helps to define the 70s era, not just in the Soviet Union, but also in the West, that we talk about the 70s as being, again, as an era. You think about the 70s as being, at least in part, defined by reaction against some of the kind of 60s sort of liberalisation and change and those sorts of things. Obviously, there are big differences. And I guess the biggest difference has to centre upon the Soviet regime itself. This is still, for all the liberalisation that I'll mention at various points, there is always authoritarianism. The regime is still very much determined to stamp out kind of sources of criticism, certainly sources of opposition, of which we don't actually see a huge amount during this period. But this kind of means, for example, while we see a sort of a new and vibrant youth culture, it doesn't tend to be as openly sort of countercultural as you see in the West. The risks associated with being, quite openly and explicitly countercultural are far higher in the Soviet case, of course, and the regime has far more control over society there. So this does have a crucial role in shaping the way that the era plays out. Of course it does. Similarly, there's a big drop in the level of repression within the country, but there is still plenty of political repression. So it drops, from tens of thousands, certainly tens of thousands per year under Stalinism being arrested as anti-Soviet, sometimes way higher than that, I should say. But by the Khrushchev era, and this is down to probably a couple of hundred a year on average across the period. So far, far less, but still this is, an authoritarian regime which will come back very firmly when challenged in any particularly significant way. And kind of moving onwards a bit from there, we can also nuance some of the important parallels. So living standards are rising, for example, in the Soviet Union, but they're still some way below in the more advanced Western countries especially. So rising is not the same as reaching the same level. Cultural liberalisation is real and it's significant, but it's never a kind of anything goes sort of cultural liberalisation, not by any stretch. So we want to keep those sorts of things in context as well.
Excellent. So you mentioned literature and sort of like the art scene a couple of moments ago. Through the book, I mean, you use the Soviet art scene and especially literature. It's definitely a through line that runs through the book. Is this a premeditated choice in terms of sort of a topic to use as a through line, or is it just something that sort of evolved as the book was being written?
No, very much a premeditated choice. I think culture and sort of cultural trends very much integral to my own sort of conception of what the 60s era was in the West especially. I'm using that as a sort of a reference point in that sense. So, if we were to do word association, probably the first thing that come to my mind of the 60s might be the Beatles, for example, or the Stones or something like that. So absolutely, culture is, I would suggest, a really important part of this. It's also particularly important in the Soviet case in that what you can't do is sort of compartmentalize, well, this is politics and this is culture, and because, and I don't mean to use the phrase just culture, but certainly it's not just culture. When you're talking about, and I've seen your video that you did on Ivan Denisovich, for example, this is way more than a book. This is a social and political phenomenon. It has members of the leadership kind of divided and spiteful. It makes Solzhenitsyn probably the most famous writer in the world for a time at least, certainly one of. Sells huge amounts, and it opens up all sorts of kind of social scars around Stalinism, not least for people who've been in the camps, of which there are vast numbers obviously kind of circulating in society at the time, people who are still in the camps, for example. So these kinds of things have a huge resonance beyond simply, people reading books. They have real life consequences. So, and this is not just the case for books. So we see, for example, there's a famous art exhibition by Picasso that happens in the late 50s. And this is kind of one of those moments where the Soviet regime sort of trips itself up, in a sense. So Picasso is a famous communist. So the Soviet regime likes Picasso as an idea. However, his art, especially the later stuff, they can't stand. It's kind of bourgeois and just everything that's wrong with art from the Soviet perspective. So when they ask Picasso if they could have an exhibition, they want his early stuff, his more kind of, traditional, sort of acceptable politically to the Soviet Union. They want to put that stuff on show. And what he says is, you can do an exhibition, but I want to pick what you put on. And he picks all the stuff that they really hate, of course. And by this stage, the Soviet Union can't, the regime can't then turn around and say, actually, no, because the sort of political fallout from censoring Picasso would be just too great. So they end up with this exhibition of works which otherwise would have no chance of being shown in the Soviet Union. And huge numbers of people go to this exhibition, first in Moscow and then in Leningrad. And some people hate it, as some people today hate anything sort of abstract and so on. But there are also lots of people who really like this, and it kind of, and it opens their eyes to the cultural restrictions which they've been living under. My God, they're producing art of a kind that we can't even conceive of in the Soviet Union because, our cultural sphere has been so sort of hemmed in and shuttered, you might say. So this then has much longer term impact around how kind of Soviets, members of the culture intelligentsia and artists and of all kinds of different spheres, filmmakers and all sorts of other people. This stuff has a much longer term social and cultural impact than you might perhaps think of in the West, for example. Beyond that, I suppose a basic point is the sheer amount of very important work which either appears or doesn't appear in this period. So we have, for example, struck me not too long ago, there are Nobel Prize for Literature winners who, in the book, for example, we have Boris Pasternak, awarded the prize and relentlessly hounded until he refuses the prize. This is a big deal. It causes international fallout of all kinds and all sorts of problems for Pasternak, obviously. Then we have Solzhenitsyn, of course, huge international star, eventually becomes kind of one of the bitterest enemies of Soviet power that there is. And then we can look at a whole bunch of others. Sholokhov, Quiet Flows the Don. He's very much in the sort of pro-regime camp, but he's a very big deal internationally as well. And then we have people who aren't famous yet at this period, like Joseph Brodsky, for example, who wins the Nobel Prize in the 80s, but his career is starting to get underway during this period. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff which doesn't really trouble the Nobel Prize type people. So this might be things like sci-fi literature, for example. The Strugatsky brothers and this sorts of thing. Absolutely huge. While, I guess this is probably true of sci-fi still today. It may not win much sort of cultural prestige, but it's hugely popular. So kind of journals with sci-fi and standalone novels and so on, millions and millions of copies are shifting throughout the period. People really care about this stuff. And there is, there's a huge wealth of kind of really important cultural figures from the period, whether this be people like directors like Tarkovsky, for example, whether it be musicians like Rostropovich, the cellist, Shostakovich, the composer. These are kind of big 20th century names. And then you've got sort of famous ballet dancers like Plisetsky, Rudolf Nureyev, obviously, who defects from the Soviet Union, causes a huge scandal, and goes on to become probably the most famous ballet dancer, at least for a layman like me. And then you also have lots of kind of very important artists, which, while they don't necessarily become huge names at the time, they do become major figures of, I suppose, Soviet and European art world. So people like Lydia Masterkova, Ilya Kabakov, these are guys who the sort of cultural ethos of the period just create spaces for them to quietly sort of exist and produce things outside, usually outside of the mainstream. And you get movies like Carnival Night, for example. So this is a sort of it's a kind of a knockabout comedy, but it's significant by being a comedy, and it has a love story within it as well. And these are things which sort of, while not completely disappeared from Stalinist culture, the human element in culture is very much resurgent under Khrushchev, and this is important. People flock to watch Carnival Night. Until recently, at least, was still shown specifically on New Year's Eve on TV and so on. It's absolutely huge resonance, and it also, it serves as a kind of a really interesting sort of gateway into the period. It's quite open in that sense, in that you have this sort of really dogmatic and pretty ignorant Stalinist official who's taken over this house of culture, and you have all these sort of young enthusiastic people who symbolize the period, and they want to have fun and they want to put on a show which is, it's politically right. I hesitate to say politically correct. It's politically right, but it's also fun and sort of light and airy. And so you have this fight of, how we do things in this country, whether you have the sort of the dogmatic hardline approach, or whether actually there is room for sort of enjoyment, even that kind of thing.
I think there's a section in the book where you talk about, as I mentioned earlier, like obviously literature is a strong through line in the book. There's a really good anecdote about the way that sort of illustrates how literature sort of starts in in the Soviet Union, and it goes abroad and then comes back in the form of Samizdat, or Tamizdat, depending on which version of it is that specifically. But the anecdote is basically that writers who couldn't get published inside the Soviet Union had their text smuggled out, and then shortwave radio would be broadcasting reading the story back in a basically in a slow enough form that would allow people to transcribe it from the radio to be able to then type it up and distribute. And I think it's a really interesting sort of play and look at how literature isn't just a domestic thing, it's also being used as a foreign tool as well.
Mm-hmm. We can also tie that in, though, with kind of other things that... So this is not just something that the poor old Soviet regime, in inverted commas, has done to it. The Soviet regime is absolutely implicated in the whole process. So you don't get Samizdat and Tamizdat without typewriters, for example. And, the consumer boom of the post-Stalin years includes things like typewriters and shortwave radios on which Western radio stations broadcast this stuff back. And also, the internationalism of the period, the growing interactions with the outside world. The way that you get material out across the Soviet border is through contacts with people like foreign tourists and students or maybe diplomats and journalists. So these kind of growing points of interaction between the Soviet Union, and this is, we're talking Moscow, Leningrad, a few big cities. It's not like every village suddenly has a correspondent from the Washington Post or something. But certainly, regime policy and reforms are as much a part of this story as kind of, brave and sneaky writers trying to push stuff out. So yeah, as I say, all these subjects, they talk to each other when you make them talk to each other.
Well, you also have great coverage of the World Youth Festival in 1957, I guess it was, which it definitely runs counter to the idea of the Soviet Union as being this closed society that's repressive, and it still is a repressive society, but it's inviting tens of thousands of youth from around the world. That there really isn't any hope of trying to control and guide in a acceptable party fashion, and it's this dichotomy of an emerging opening and emerging liberalization versus like this repressive notion. It's really quite a fascinating section of the book.
Oh, thank you. The kind of the waves coming out from the World Youth Festival go on throughout as well. So this is. The authorities do try and exert control over this, but they're aware that they're in a bind. You don't invite all these people over to show them how great the Soviet Union really is. The idea basically is to sort of to get past Western propaganda, which gives you these sorts of Orwellian images of the Soviet Union. And ultimately, Khrushchev sort of reckons to himself, the way you do that is to bring people and show them. And this is especially aimed at youth in the developing world. This is for then Khrushchev's sort of key target constituency. And they do want to exert a certain amount of control. Obviously, there are KGB people milling around the whole time. There are, Soviet youth are trained in how you deal with foreigners. But equally, that doesn't completely, erode the fact that there's a huge amount of genuine fun going on. And there's there are exhibitions of the kinds of artworks which would never normally be shown. There are jazz bands playing which would never get a gig normally. And there's a huge amount of interaction, both kind of public on Red Square of people sort of, playing the guitar and singing songs into the middle of the night. And then supposedly also there's this sort of sexual revolution going on between Soviet youth and visiting foreigners and so on. Quite how much of that is sort of apocryphal, I don't know. You would have to say some of it, but probably not all. That's as much as I'm willing to commit to on that front. But yeah, the Youth Festival is absolutely fascinating. Definitely one of those moments where you think, I'd love to have, to have gone and seen and sort of. But as I said, it leaves a mark on the day after the festival finished. The Komsomol boss, who's kind of in charge of overseeing everything, says, it's been fantastic. We've achieved what we wanted to in propaganda terms. And then as the months and years unfold, they get a clearer appreciation of, well, young people have been exposed, not just those at the festival, but those following on, I almost said following online, those kind of following in the press and so on. Because there's lots of TV and press coverage. They're becoming more and more interested in these jazz bands and this painting and these Western culture, and people are buying, jeans and other trinkets and so on. So the sort of seeping westernization of Soviet youth culture, while it doesn't begin with the festival, it gets a real boost from it, which is challenging for the regime in all kinds of ways in the long run.
So let's talk about Khrushchev, because I find him to be both fascinating in a lot of ways, quite a sympathetic character. He's a man that I clearly genuinely believed in the communist project, and he wanted better for the people of the Soviet Union. But it's these like waves of erratic is probably underselling it at some points, but couldn't bring about communism as to its a successful conclusion. And it's these strange shifts back and forth between liberalization on one side and repression on the other, both domestically and internationally. Quite erratic in a lot of ways, and very, very sort of drop of the hat and individualism. So let's talk a little bit about this. Like, how did his successes or failures mark the period? I think that's probably the ultimate question.
That's a good question. I suppose the place to start is that there are huge successes that we can chalk up for the credit column for Khrushchev. And I don't say this to disregard the minuses, but for example, emptying the Gulag probably needed to be done, and possibly some of his rivals, Malenkov, for example, were at least as important in this process. But certainly this is crucial for the lives of a huge number of people, not just those who are in the camps, but also family and friends and so on. They all carry the stain of having a loved one who's officially been branded an enemy. Things like ending the Stalin cult, support for liberalization from colonialism in Africa, for example, whether this is support for Ghana or Congo or Algeria or what. Khrushchev is, at least in some instances, he picks sides which, history has kind of come to see as being the right side of things. He also sort of renews and amplifies messages about, for example, equality of the sexes, talking about doing more to liberate Soviet women. Doesn't necessarily deliver on all this, but, to at least to start the discussion is at least something, because there really wasn't much of a discussion in practice, especially under Stalin. They were very hard years, the post-war Stalin years, for women especially. And so Khrushchev does a lot. And we can see the same in terms of non-Russian peoples. There is an increasing acceptance of non-Russians within reason. That's perhaps not the phrase I wanted. Within bounds, sort of having more scope to celebrate their own national cultures and so on. This, as I said, there are limits, and if you cross those limits, which are not always understood, then Moscow will still come down on you like a ton of bricks. But certainly, there are all kinds of different areas where you can see that progress has been made. I think we can also point to the inverse, though, where we look at things like persecution of religious believers and so on. And so we can't give a kind of, an unambiguous picture about this. Khrushchev certainly, as the sort of period progresses by the early 60s, is becoming more and more difficult, certainly for those around him, more and more intolerant of criticism, more and more unwilling to heed advice when sensible people try and talk him out of kind of very bold ideas. And I think it's probably safe to say, well, I don't wish to get into the sort of psychology of the man or anything like this, but I think you do to some extent have to look to his formative years sort of upbringing as being really atypical for a major world leader. So Khrushchev has only a handful of years of proper schooling, and even this is really rudimentary stuff. He's not a very kind of subtle or careful thinker at all. And, I suppose in that sense, he's also very much shaped by the kind of formative years of Stalinism, what they might talk about as, at least in the Soviet context, the sort of heroic years of the 20s and 30s when they're building through industrialization these kind of great big plants in the middle of nowhere and new towns and cities, and it feels like the Soviet Union is sort of conquering nature. They always talk about conquering nature, not sort of working with nature, and that the country is being transformed, and Khrushchev kind of thinks, well, I guess if you apply enough willpower and you really want something, you can do this kind of thing, and this leaves him, I would suggest, kind of drawn to the notion, or anchored in the notion, that if you just push hard enough, you don't need to think too carefully about these things. So we see, for example, the Virgin Land scheme that starts in the 50s but rolls on for a long time beyond that. Ultimately, he thinks the way to solve the country's food problems, and I should say actually this issue is also one which doesn't get highlighted enough for the period. Under Stalin, we've seen repeated famines in which millions have died. Khrushchev puts a stop to the famines. Firstly, he tries to put the stop through the Virgin Land scheme, and when that doesn't work, he starts buying grain abroad, which is demeaning, and he's resented for it, but we don't get starvation like we would have done. There is no starvation like there would have been under Stalin. But to come back to the question about the Virgin Lands, so this idea that Khrushchev thinks, a good, hard campaign and we can achieve everything. Essentially, how do we fix the grain problem in the country? We get vast numbers of young people to volunteer their time and to go out to Siberia and to Kazakhstan and start digging up new land for cultivation. Doesn't sound like the sexiest topic on earth, I know. But the stories of what happens when you essentially let sort of 300,000 young people go wild in northern Kazakhstan and eastern Russia, some of it sounds absolutely fantastic, some of it sounds truly awful, especially a hard experience for lots of the women who were there, being kind of continually harassed by drunken youths and so on. But there's also lots of kind of great stories of, friendships being formed that last forever and sort of, adventure in the middle of nowhere. There's a sense of kind of people doing something for their country. But ultimately, this is badly planned, badly executed, and within a couple of years, it's sort of coming apart at the seams. It's not a complete loss in every single respect, but certainly the key goal of fixing the agricultural economy doesn't happen, because ultimately kind of Khrushchev throws the idea together, people criticize the shortcomings in it or say, well, you can't, that won't work and this won't work, and he swats them aside, does it anyway, and it turns out to be no good. And it's the same basic picture with the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. Khrushchev, he always says that the Cuban putting missiles in Cuba is about defending Cuba from the US. And probably that might be a part of it somewhere in his thinking. But he's also acutely aware, of course, that America has much, much greater capacity in terms of the distance its missiles can travel. America has way more missiles that can hit the Soviet Union than the Soviet Union does that can hit the USA. So Khrushchev thinks, well, if we put loads of our shorter range missiles on Cuba, then we can, we have the same kind of impact. And he thinks you do this secretly, then you announce them, and America has to do what we had to do when they put missiles in Italy and Turkey, and they complain for a while and then say, okay, that's the reality and we'll live with it. As we know, that's not how this pans out. But the story is, again, that Khrushchev has a sort of, a bold idea to fix a big, intransigent, complex problem with a sort of a swipe, and it falls apart. It turns into a humiliating encounter all round. Opinion is slightly divided on how badly this is a defeat for the Soviet Union, but certainly it's not good news for Khrushchev in career terms and sort of public standing and so on. I suppose another thing...
Ultimately, the lack of publicity in terms of what the Soviets got from the deal is is really what, like, we can look at it now in 2023 in hindsight and say that, it's like what the Soviet Union got was actually probably could even be considered a win in some, by depending on what your definitions are. But certainly the lack of publicity of the withdrawal of intermediate missiles, like the Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy. But that seems so on point for Khrushchev, where it's like, try this big, as you said, try this big bold thing, and then it sort of fails, and there's no ability to control the message that goes with it, and it's okay, move on to the next big bold thing to try to recover.
Yeah, he's not the sort of the Soviet Union, for example, has huge amounts of genuine experts on, for example, the foreign ministry. By the 60s, they're churning out very, very well-educated and pretty well-informed specialists throughout the foreign ministry. This is just one example. We could see this in, economics and planning and anywhere else. And the reality is that Khrushchev will come up with an idea, and all those experts can just go hang, because his one idea, which may or may not coincide with what they have to say, but if it doesn't, then tough luck to the guys who actually know the situation. They'll be completely overridden. And he says as much, kind of very openly at times. If your plan looks the same as mine, then fine. If it doesn't, then get lost, because we're doing it my way. And this, it's dispiriting for all these experts that they have, and it's also problematic because sometimes experts know what they're doing. The other thing to say in this respect around Khrushchev is to emphasize that he's not as powerful as Stalin was within the Soviet system. He faces a lot more resistance, whether that be kind of overt or covert, within the leadership at times, and also lower down the ranks of the system. That the Soviet system actually has never quite had the power that some people used to think, in terms of being able to impose its will absolutely anywhere. At multiple stages, we've seen that the regime, even under Stalin, wants X, tries to get X, and then backs away because it's just not working. Whether this be, taking on religion or whatever. And we see that certainly with Khrushchev, when they make attempts to take on, again, religion in the 50s and in the 60s. Actually, what happens is religion comes back stronger. And, this is not just a Soviet phenomenon. But we see it also with anti-alcohol campaigns and so on and so forth. There's lots of kind of sound and fury about kind of cutting down on alcoholism, which is a big problem in terms of productivity, workplace safety, in terms of domestic violence, all kinds of suicides. But alcohol consumption just keeps on growing. The Soviet regime doesn't seem able to kind of get a hold on this at all. So it's not just that Khrushchev is less powerful within the leadership. He definitely is less powerful within the leadership. It's also that the Soviet regime isn't quite so sort of, it isn't as able to control things as people used to think anyway.
So moving on to, let's look at like Khrushchev's ouster from power. I think in a lot of minds, and certainly mine for quite a while, his ouster was recognized almost as an end to the Soviet liberalization period. It's the end of the thaw, those types of things, and then basically morphed into the stagnation that we saw of the Brezhnev era. But you paint a very different picture in the book. So how fair an assessment is that of that shift from liberalization into stagnation?
So certainly I could have ended the book at 1964 with the end of Khrushchev. I don't think that would have been a very controversial thing to do at all. But instead I've pictured the end of the period not as the end of Khrushchev, but with 1968 and the Prague Spring. And there are various reasons for this. Firstly, I would say that this idea we have of sort of relative liberal Khrushchev and then conservative Brezhnev regime coming in is true when looked at from a greater distance, but the more you sort of zoom in to the crossover period, then the less that stands up. I would suggest to you that the the early 1960s, Khrushchev's last couple of years as they head into the mid-60s, there's less and less sign of sort of liberalising agenda going on. I suppose you do have things like, for example, the publication of Ivan Denisovich. So I don't mean to paint a picture completely without nuance, but certainly you also have issues around, for example, the KGB's remit is growing all the time from the early 60s. The use of the death penalty has started to expand around things like economic crimes and so on. Khrushchev has become louder and more bullying towards the creative intelligentsia. There's this huge sort of affair at the Manège Gallery in Moscow, where he essentially starts throwing around all sorts of insults at painters and sculptors whose work he doesn't like, and he's accusing people and threatening to send people to logging camps and so on. And while that's a one-off instance, the general picture of the last part of the Khrushchev period, I would suggest, doesn't really fit with this wider characterization of liberalization. And conversely, the same is kind of the case for the early Brezhnev period. So it's absolutely right to think about the Brezhnev era in general as being a sort of a pretty conservative period in lots of ways, culturally and politically and so on. But the first few years are a bit more ambiguous in this respect. It's clear that Khrushchev is the key force for liberalisation in the country. And so when he's gone, the sort of any momentum that there was has largely gone with him. But that doesn't mean to say that the guys who come in are instantly sort of hardline Stalinists dragging the country back to the 1940s. Brezhnev in particular, there are insiders, and I mention this in the book, within the Soviet system, sort of, like civil servant type people backstage, party advisors and so on, who think, well, Khrushchev's actually become a real pain, he's difficult, we've had enough really of all these outbursts. Maybe Brezhnev, things will, maybe this actually is a step forward. I don't mean to say this is a universal approach to the coup, but certainly there are some who know the system from the inside and who are sort of liberal-minded, who think, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing. Brezhnev's a fairly mild-mannered sort of person, kind of a technocratic approach. They think, well, maybe actually, if we lose Khrushchev, then we can start moving forwards with sort of plans for liberalisation and so on. And it does kind of look this way for a little while at least. There is the early Brezhnev period has its own thaw of sorts. So Pasternak is published again, Solzhenitsyn is published again. We're not talking about a huge sort of cultural revival, but there are clear signs that it's not necessarily doom and gloom for the kind of cultural sphere. Probably most importantly, or potentially most importantly, it looks like there will be real attempts to tackle real problems. So Brezhnev starts to pour in great deal of effort and resource into improving the agricultural situation, which is still a mess. That Khrushchev has tinkered in all kinds of ways, and it's still a mess. And actually, Brezhnev improves things a bit, but it's still not great. So things like rural Soviet citizens, their living standards start to go up as there's more welfare added, and all kinds of people actually find their lives improving after Khrushchev is gone, in all sorts of different ways. But certainly there are forces around Brezhnev who are kind of pushing for a much more, if not outright Stalinism, then at least a harder line on a whole host of issues. And they're growing stronger fairly quickly. And the key to sort of seeing those guys fully in the saddle, I suppose, is where I've ended the book with the Prague Spring. So this is, in case anyone doesn't know what the Prague Spring is, this is when the Czechoslovak Communist Party, so allied to the Soviet Union, not in the Soviet Union, they start to think, well, the way that we're going to save communism in Czechoslovakia is through reform, by re-engaging people, by kind of the sort of thing that Khrushchev was doing in the mid-50s, of trying to get people passionate and optimistic about the communist future. And this includes a whole bunch of reforms around, elections and freedom of travel and so on, which scare the life out of the Soviet leadership because they know people will want this in the Soviet Union as well. And so increasingly, sort of, especially throughout '68, we can see that the Soviet regime under Brezhnev is growing more and more overtly anti-reform. So attempts to reform the economy get started under Kosygin, 1965, and fairly quickly that dies. This is perhaps the last real chance to save the Soviet economy by imposing some serious reforms. As the political mood turns against any and all reform, that sort of blows this chance of, I don't know if Kosygin would have saved the Soviet economy, but certainly the mess that it got itself into further and further is evidence that there were real problems. That said, even after the kind of conservative turn is absolutely clear, what we don't have is a sort of a return to full-on Stalinism, which some people used to talk about in the literature about re-Stalinization. Certainly there's no more attacks on Stalin. That stuff is not going to be permissible anymore. But equally, there's not really much in terms of kind of regime praise for him either. There are fights backstage about, when it comes up to an anniversary around the victory in the war, for example, there is the sort of pro-Stalin party trying to get Brezhnev to give memorial speeches in which he talks about how great Stalin's leadership was, and that generally doesn't happen. So the regime, and we never see a kind of a return to the full-blooded political repression of the Stalin years. There is political repression, of course there is, but certainly nothing on the scale that we see under Stalin. So you might say in that sense that this is partly the sort of Khrushchev legacy. This is, potentially his greatest achievement. But you also have to say that Brezhnev gets some of the credit for this as well. He has the chance to do it and ultimately sort of backs away. He's able to understand that this would be very damaging in all sorts of ways if we now, after all the revelations about Stalin's crimes under Khrushchev, if we sort of walk that all the way back and start a new love affair with Stalin, then that would do a huge amount of damage to the Soviet reputation across the world. So, yeah, bits of both going on in that sense.
Now, you've just made a comment and it sort of hints at what my next question is. And this is purely an opinion piece from yourself, and that's by the end of the Soviet 60s, sort of that 68 sort of time frame, do you feel that the seeds had seeds already been sown for the collapse of what was to come in the late 1980s?
Yes and no. More yes, actually. So
that's a very historian answer.
Yes, I know. So there are definitely important threads that you can see in the late 80s as the system is falling apart, and you can see those threads going back to the 60s without question. But I would definitely avoid any sort of sense that the collapse has become inevitable by the late 60s. I think Gorbachev has way too much agency in the way that things pan out, from the middle of the 80s onwards, that we can't talk about anything being inevitable, I'd suggest, until we get much further in. But there are some very important themes of the collapse period that we can trace back to the 60s. So, for example, one of the chief problems that Gorbachev has by the end of the 80s is that basically the ruling Communist Party becomes increasingly divided within itself between a sort of a liberal element which backs reform as the way to save the system and a more hardline conservative / Stalinist element. And I think this is a divide which maybe it doesn't open up for the first time under Khrushchev, but we do see that become prominent under Khrushchev, that you have people who in the name of saving and improving the system want to see reform. They want deeper changes, they want more open discussion of Stalin's crimes, and that's the way that we help the Soviet system, by overcoming these challenges. But you also see the opposite, which is people who also have the best interests of the Soviet system at heart, but they say you don't wash your dirty laundry in public, that if you want to do the Soviet system a favour, then we stop talking about this stuff. And that is a split very much evident later on in the 80s. It's largely sort of submerged during the Brezhnev period. Lots of the key sort of liberal-minded communists certainly at the top, find themselves pushed out, or else they remain in the background and so on. But they come sort of rushing back in the 80s, not least into the sort of cultural sphere, where you get all sorts of liberal-minded apparatchiks who were binned off in the late 60s. Suddenly they're editing newspapers in the 80s, and they're pushing this sort of liberal communist agenda again. The second thread I would point toward would be around economic stagnation, which I mentioned earlier. So this is the Kosygin reforms, a real chance to sort of start turning the Soviet economy from, I suppose, growth by by extensive growth, which is, you know, digging up more soil, getting more oil out of the ground, to intensive growth, which is, you know, working smarter, basically producing more for less. This is the aim of the Kosygin reforms. The Soviet regime never manages to pull this off. So the economic underpinnings of the Soviet collapse, while I can't say for sure, as I said, that Kosygin would have saved the Soviet economy, we can say that it was basically condemned by not undertaking serious reform. And we can also, in this sense, think about, for example, computers and computing. This is an area the Soviet Union, at least according to those involved, was essentially on a par with the US by the early 60s. There's huge amounts of research, huge amounts of optimism about, they talk about computers as machines of communism, about that, you know, you can do economic planning in a way more sophisticated way when you're doing it on a computer rather than with vast ledgers and so on. They think computers might save the Soviet economy, and then they stop developing them and just start stealing Western models, and that becomes a dead end. You can also point to unresolved political problems. So, for example, Stalin has become hugely explosive in Glasnost. Not least these sort of really horrific scenes of people digging up mass graves and so on, the memorial, now sadly banned in Russia. But certainly this stuff starts to be talked about under Khrushchev with the secret speech and so on, but always again within bounds, and it's not a problem that's sort of exercised fully. It sort of lifts the top off the plaster and then puts it back on, and it's still there festering by the 80s. A fourth point I would mention in this respect about nationalities. So one of the key forces that pulls the Soviet Union apart across the 80s and the start of the 90s are the different nationalities. And I'm thinking primarily about non-Russian peoples here, but Russians also have a role in this, certainly with Boris Yeltsin and sort of, you know, mustering Russian enthusiasm for their own country and so on. What we see after Stalin is, I've mentioned already, a sort of a growing acceptance of, you know, that Ukrainians can celebrate Ukrainian culture. And again, this is very much bounded, and if you step over the bounds, there's trouble. But you can see these sort of small nation-building type dynamics. So, for example, coming back to Ukraine, there's more room to talk about, for example, and celebrate Taras Shevchenko, who's Ukraine's sort of great national writer. There are Ukrainian language dictionaries published and books on the history of Ukraine. This is all Soviet-led. It's not, you know, this is not like an open challenge to Soviet dominance in Ukraine. And you get, you know, a Ukrainian film studio making movies in Ukrainian language and so on. So you get these sort of building blocks of nations appearing more than they have previously under Soviet rule. And then, you know, but this is to some extent suppressed after the 60s era is over, but certainly it comes roaring back in the 80s when, you know, as I said, you know, the different non-Russian peoples especially are pushing to have their particular republic, whether this be Lithuania or Estonia or Ukraine or Georgia, that, you know, we've had enough, we want out. Certainly, I think. The obvious one to cite in this case is Zviad Gamsakherdia, who is, he's shot. No, he's not shot. He's arrested in 56, 57 after this big protest. He's in Tbilisi. He starts an underground group. He ends up in jail. He ends up leading Georgian independence in 91. So there are important threads we can see in that way. We can also think about, for example, belief in communism. It seems this is a really tricky one to sort of really nail down, but we see, for example, there's a clear sense that the mid-50s, when Khrushchev he's denounced Stalin and he's talking about building communism again, it seems quite clear that there is sort of an upsurge in optimism about the communist future coming. The kind of typical notion in the literature then is that this is fading the whole time across the 60s, and by 68, certainly with the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the more liberal-minded, moderate wing of communism has suffered a fairly compelling defeat, and it's not at all clear that that faith in the communist project has survived much. And so by the 80s, it seems pretty clear that there's not a great deal of expectation of communist utopia ever arriving, but certainly this is something that seems to be fading across the 60s as well.
Thank you. So I think we're going to start sort of wrapping up here. I've got one sort of last question, and it's coming back to sort of like your research process in any piece of work that you do, and especially one that's that covers this sort of breadth and scope. There's always got to be at least one sort of surprising or shocking revelation or sort of discovery that an author comes across as you're doing your work. Can you share one of those with us?
I'm not sure I have a single one to point you towards, unfortunately. There's a whole bunch of kind of really fascinating and enjoying anecdotes that I came across about, for example, the different kinds of criminal enterprises that people set up, about the way people would steal anything and everything from the workplace. There's a really good moment in there where I talk about Khrushchev on a visit to Uzbekistan. He gets his republics mixed up and he thinks he's talking to Tajiks and he's slagging off Uzbeks. But essentially he's talking to about 500,000 Uzbeks until somebody tells him, and he styles it out in really poor fashion, pretending it was a joke, that he's glad that they were all in on the joke. Loads of little bits and pieces like that. About Yuri Gagarin, for example, he's supposed to be the star turn at the 22nd Party Congress, and actually, days before, his wife catches him in a hotel room with another woman. He jumps off the balcony and smashes his face to bits on the floor outside the hotel, and he can't turn up for the Congress, which obviously drives Khrushchev and others pretty furious at him. I think probably for readers, the kind of maybe the key sort of revelation that they'll take away is that the picture we have of the Soviet Union doesn't have to be one of sort of this terrifying Stalinist sort of mass violence and repression, or else at the other end where you have this sort of decaying hulk of the Gorbachev period, where essentially the country is in a spiral heading towards doom, and everything is shuttered and rusty. What we have is a really kind of quite vibrant period where the Soviet Union genuinely is a challenger to the US, and it's not at all clear around the end of the 50s, the early 60s especially, who's going to win the Cold War. It looks at various stages like the Soviet Union is ahead, and there are people in Washington DC who really worry about this sort of thing. So I think in that sense the revelation might be around the extent to which this is a period different to other periods that have been really well covered of Soviet history in the mainstream literature. I don't think this period has been as well covered as you'll find easily half a dozen Stalin biographies in your local sort of mid-sized bookstore, and I think this period probably has some catching up to do in that sense. So there's that point to it, yeah.
That's on that note, Dr. Hornsby, I would like to thank you very much for your time today. This has been for those of most of you probably won't know, this is actually the second time that we're doing this. We had some sound quality issues the first time, so I would like to extra thank Dr. Hornsby for his time and dedication to this twice. That book again is The Soviet Sixties. Go please. It's available now. Please go purchase your copy. Go down to your local bricks and mortar, your local bookstore, throw them the love and the support that they all need and deserve. They're the anchor and the cornerstone of a good neighborhood. Amazon, if
I second that message.
Amazon, if you absolutely have to, but your local bookstore should be the absolute first place you go to check this out. But definitely do go pick this up, The Soviet Sixties. Dr. Hornsby, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, David.
This is the Cold War channel, and we will see you the next time out. Thanks so much.